I want to begin this video from a place that is almost always rushed past in debates about religion, a place that people acknowledge only briefly before hurrying toward louder questions, even though this is precisely the point where everything quietly tightens into a knot and refuses to loosen again. Not with the familiar question, does God exist? That question has been sitting on the table for centuries, passed from generation to generation, argued, defended, attacked, rephrased, and repeated so many times that it has almost lost its ability to disturb us in any meaningful way. Instead, I want to step further back and ask something more fundamental, something that usually goes unexamined. What does it actually mean, on a psychological and intellectual level, to introduce the idea of God into a universe at all? To take that idea seriously, and to place it at the very center of how we understand life, reality, causation, and ourselves. Because most of the time, when people say they are talking about God, they are not really talking about God in any rigorous sense. What they are actually describing is the way the human mind responds to uncertainty, complexity, and fear, and the way it reaches for explanations that feel complete, even when they are not. Richard Dawkins, in the God Delusion, and more specifically in the chapter titled The God Hypothesis, focuses precisely on this overlooked point, not by attacking faith emotionally or culturally, but by reframing the entire conversation in a way that quietly removes its protective armor. He does not approach God as comfort, as tradition, or as a cultural inheritance passed gently from one generation to the next. He does not treat God as a symbol or a metaphor. Instead, he approaches God in the coldest and most unsettling way possible, as a hypothesis. And that word matters far more than it initially seems. A hypothesis is not sacred. It is not untouchable. It is not protected by reverence, habit, or emotional attachment. A hypothesis can be right, or it can be wrong. And most importantly, a hypothesis must remain open to evaluation, criticism, and revision in light of evidence. This is where Dawkins becomes deeply unsettling, because he is not asking the familiar and almost harmless question, do you believe in God? He is asking something far more uncomfortable, something that shifts the ground beneath the discussion entirely. Is God actually necessary to explain the universe? At that moment, the conversation stops being about belief, stops being about identity, upbringing, or personal meaning, and quietly turns into a question about explanation itself. In this chapter, Dawkins is not trying to convert anyone, and he is not interested in humiliating believers or scoring rhetorical victories. He is doing something far more dangerous than that. He is laying assumptions on the table, assumptions that usually remain invisible, and asking a single, calm, but destabilizing question. Which explanations genuinely explain, and which ones merely make us feel satisfied while leaving the real work undone? That is why this chapter is one of the most disturbing parts of the God Delusion. Because beneath the discussion of God, what is really being examined is the structure of human thought itself, and the ease with which we confuse emotional resolution with intellectual clarity. So, in this video, we are not going to try to prove that God exists, and we are not going to try to disprove it either. Instead, we are going to look at something deeper and far more revealing. Why does Dawkins insist on treating the idea of God as a scientific problem rather than a purely philosophical or theological one? Where does the apparent explanatory power of this hypothesis actually come from? And most importantly, does the God hypothesis genuinely explain anything at all? Or does it simply place a comforting curtain between us and what we do not yet understand? This is where we begin. One age's religion is the literary entertainment of the next. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Richard Dawkins does not ease the reader into this chapter, nor does he attempt to prepare the ground gently or soften the impact of what is about to be said. And instead, within the very first pages, he places an unsettling image directly in front of us, almost as if to make one thing immediately clear. If we are going to speak seriously about the idea of God, then we must first be honest about the stories, the characters, and the inherited narratives through which this idea enters our minds in the first place. He describes the God of the Old Testament not cautiously, not diplomatically, but bluntly, as one of the most unpleasant characters ever introduced into literature, a figure portrayed as jealous, insecure, obsessively controlling, prone to rage, unapologetically violent, hostile toward women, quick to punish, slow to forgive, and entirely willing to destroy those who disobey, dissent, or simply exist outside the boundaries he has drawn. At first glance, this description can sound exaggerated, even deliberately provocative, as though Dawkins were merely trying to shock the reader or score an emotional point. But what he is actually pointing toward is something far more subtle and far more disturbing than provocation. People who grow up immersed in these texts often stop noticing their severity altogether, not because the content becomes gentler, but because familiarity dulls perception. What once might have appeared cruel or terrifying gradually becomes normalized, justified, ritualized, and eventually placed beyond questioning, protected not by argument, but by habit. For an outsider, however, the picture looks entirely different. Dawkins shares a telling example that exposes this contrast with almost embarrassing clarity. Winston Churchill's son, Randolph, despite his cultural background and social position, had barely read the Bible at all, and when challenged to read it from beginning to end, his reaction was not reverence or spiritual elevation, but shock, laughter, disbelief, and at times genuine horror. Because to him the text was not sacred, not insulated by tradition, but something encountered fresh, raw, and unfiltered, revealing a narrative that was often brutal, inconsistent, and deeply unsettling. Thomas Jefferson reached a remarkably similar conclusion long before Dawkins, describing the Christian God as cruel, angry, capricious, and unjust, which quietly reminds us that this discomfort is not a modern invention, not a product of contemporary secularism, but an objection that has existed for centuries, repeatedly postponed, softened, or politely ignored. Yet at this point, Dawkins deliberately steps back, because his real aim is not to attack a specific image of God, not to dismantle Yahweh, Jesus, Allah, or Zeus one by one, a task he openly admits would be an easy target and ultimately a distraction. What he wants to address is something far more fundamental. He reframes the discussion around a defensible definition of what the God hypothesis actually is, stripped of poetry, symbolism, and emotional insulation. And the definition itself is simple, almost modest, but radical in its implications. Is there a superhuman, supernatural intelligence that deliberately designed the universe and everything within it? At this stage, the conversation has shifted completely. We are no longer discussing morality, meaning, or personal comfort. We are not listening to testimony or engaging in theology. We are examining an explanatory model, a claim about how reality itself came to be structured. And this is where Dawkins' objection truly begins. A mind complex enough to design a universe cannot simply appear without cause, explanation, or history. Such a mind would itself represent an extraordinary level of complexity. And complexity, as Dawkins insists, does not emerge fully formed, but requires a long, gradual, cumulative process to come into existence. And if that is the case, then this mind must come after the universe, not before it, which means it cannot be the universe's designer. This conclusion is more unsettling than a straightforward denial of God, because Dawkins is not simply rejecting God as false. He is setting God aside as unnecessary, as an explanation that adds complexity without reducing mystery, that raises more questions than it resolves. And he does not stop there. He argues that this idea is not harmless, that the God hypothesis is not merely incorrect, but actively damaging. Not because it offers comfort, but because it discourages deeper inquiry by providing premature closure where curiosity should remain open. Why this is so, he explains gradually, step by step, in the chapters that follow. But even here, something essential becomes clear. The God hypothesis has never existed in a single fixed form. Across history, human thought has moved from tribal spirits to polytheism, from polytheism to monotheism, and from localized gods to abstract cosmic ones. The shapes change, the names change, the attributes shift, but the underlying mental operation remains strikingly similar. Faced with uncertainty, ignorance, and lack of control, the human mind produces an explanation, turns what it cannot yet understand into a story, and then, over time, places that story beyond criticism. What Dawkins does in this chapter is make that process visible. He is not putting God on trial. He is placing the mind that creates God under examination. Dawkins begins this part of the discussion from an angle that is far more subtle than most readers expect, because instead of immediately criticizing gods, myths, or rituals, he starts by questioning an assumption that is so deeply embedded in our historical imagination that it is almost never examined. The idea that the transition from polytheism to monotheism represents a clear and unquestionable intellectual advancement. We are so accustomed to hearing this transition described as progress, as a movement away from something primitive and chaotic toward something refined and rational, that it rarely occurs to us to ask whether this narrative itself deserves scrutiny, or whether it is simply a story we have inherited and repeated until it hardened into common sense. Why, Dawkins asks, do we instinctively treat numerical reduction as evidence of cognitive improvement, as if fewer gods automatically meant better thinking, deeper reasoning, or greater philosophical sophistication? Why should the movement from many gods to one god be interpreted as an upgrade of the mind, rather than as nothing more than a shift in narrative style, a preference for a simpler cast of characters in an increasingly centralized cultural story? History is often written as though this development were inevitable, as though human thought were always destined to converge on monotheism. But inevitability is not the same as truth, and familiarity is not the same as coherence. He draws attention to an observation by Ibn Warraq that quietly destabilizes the entire premise, not through confrontation, but through logic. If reducing the number of gods is what counts as progress, then monotheism itself appears unfinished. One god can still be reduced further, down to none at all. And if internal consistency is the goal, then atheism may simply be monotheism carried to its logical conclusion, one final step along the same path. Seen from this angle, the conceptual distance between one god and zero gods begins to look far smaller than believers usually admit, and the supposed intellectual chasm separating the two starts to dissolve. What makes this even more revealing is how institutional authority responds to this spectrum of belief. Dawkins points out that even the Catholic Encyclopedia dismisses polytheism and atheism with nearly identical indifference. Polytheism is described as something that cannot satisfy philosophical minds, while atheism is portrayed as something that has failed to persuade people. Both are quietly placed outside the boundaries of acceptable belief, not through argument or evidence, but through classification. Once this abstract hierarchy of beliefs enters the legal system, the consequences become stranger still. Until relatively recently, charity laws in England and Scotland explicitly favored monotheistic religions, while excluding polytheistic belief systems altogether. Secular organizations were subjected to intense scrutiny, forced to demonstrate tangible public benefit, while institutions whose primary purpose was the propagation of monotheistic doctrine were often granted tax exemption almost automatically. Dawkins identifies a quiet but unmistakable injustice here. If the standard for charitable status is public benefit, then religion as a category should not receive automatic immunity. This problem becomes especially glaring in places like the United States, where churches and televangelists control vast amounts of tax-exempt wealth, often with minimal oversight, raising serious questions about what, exactly, is being subsidized. One of the most striking illustrations of this imbalance is the case of Oral Roberts. On a televised broadcast, Roberts told his audience that God would kill him unless they sent him $8 million. Against all rational expectation, the money arrived. Roberts survived. And today, his name is attached to a university worth hundreds of millions of dollars, which he claims was designed according to direct divine instructions, down to the architectural details themselves. All of this unfolded without serious legal challenge, protected by the same exemption that treats belief not as a claim to be evaluated, but as a virtue to be respected. At this point, Dawkins makes an important clarification. If polytheism is to be criticized as incoherent, then monotheism must be examined with the same level of scrutiny, because in practice, the boundary between them is often far less clear than theology pretends. In Hinduism, for example, what appears at first glance to be polytheism is frequently defended as monism beneath the surface. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, Ganesha, and countless other deities are described not as separate gods, but as manifestations of a single underlying reality, different faces of one ultimate principle. This logic is not foreign to Christianity. The doctrine of the Trinity has generated centuries of debate, division, and bloodshed precisely because it attempts to occupy an unstable conceptual space. Is God one or three? Are the persons distinct or identical? What does substance even mean in this context? Thomas Jefferson's response to this is blunt and uncompromising. You cannot reason about what you cannot understand. To him, the Trinity was not a mystery to be honored, but a verbal construction designed to conceal confusion. And perhaps this helps explain why theology, unlike science or philosophy, shows so little cumulative progress across centuries. Its central problems are preserved, ritualized, and inherited, rather than resolved. Dawkins also identifies another recurring pattern that runs through religious systems. Doctrines tend to make extremely specific claims precisely in domains where evidence is, by definition, unavailable. And paradoxically, the less evidence there is, the more aggressively certainty is asserted. As ambiguity increases, tolerance shrinks, and minor disagreements escalate into hostility. This tendency is especially visible within Catholic theology. The Trinity is followed by the elevation of Mary. Mary is followed by thousands of saints, each assigned a specialized domain: illnesses, accidents, professions, travel, even digestive problems. Angels are arranged into elaborate hierarchies, ranks, and functions, all described with the confidence of direct observation. As Dawkins notes, this is no longer explanation, it is fabrication. When Pope John Paul II survived an assassination attempt and attributed his survival to the intervention of Our Lady of Fatima, the casual ease with which such details were supplied became impossible to ignore. No one asked what the other virgins were doing at the time. The story required no internal accounting, no balancing of causes. At this stage, Dawkins loses interest in extending the debate between polytheism and monotheism. The difference between one imaginary being and many imaginary beings is not, to him, philosophically deep enough to justify prolonged attention. He draws a clear boundary. This book is not an anthropological catalog of religious diversity. It is not an exploration of how inventive human imagination can be. Its focus is far more direct: the supernatural itself, and more specifically, those forms of supernatural belief that currently exert the greatest political influence, shape laws, justify power, and structure everyday lives. Finally, Dawkins anticipates a familiar objection. You reject the same God I reject, people often say, pointing to a crude image of an old man with a beard sitting on a cloud. To Dawkins, this caricature is a distraction. The real issue lies not with childish images, but with the more abstract, sophisticated-sounding explanations that replace them. Explanations that feel elevated yet rest on no firmer ground. Dawkins is not targeting a particular image of God. He is targeting all gods, all supernatural explanations, regardless of where, when, or under what name they appear. When Dawkins moves from polytheism to monotheism, the tone of the book shifts in a way that is immediately noticeable. Because at this point, religion is no longer treated as a loose collection of myths, symbolic figures, or imaginative narratives that can be examined from a safe distance. What he is dealing with now is something far more central, far more entrenched, and far more invasive. A belief system that has shaped moral intuitions, legal structures, political authority, and everyday life for centuries. This is precisely why he turns to Gore Vidal's remark with such care and intention, allowing it to sit uncomfortably rather than rushing past it. Vidal once described monotheism as the great unmentionable evil at the center of our culture. A sentence that sounds deliberately provocative at first, almost exaggerated, yet one that Dawkins clearly believes deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as rhetorical excess. Sky gods, the eternal father figure, absolute authority projected upward and then mirrored downward into social hierarchies, and woven deeply into this structure, the long historical consequences of that authority, particularly for women, whose bodies, roles, and freedoms have so often been placed under religious supervision. Dawkins does not approach this emotionally or rhetorically. Instead, he draws a historical line. He begins with Judaism, the oldest of the three Abrahamic religions, and at its origin he finds a distinctly tribal God, jealous, demanding, intensely preoccupied with obedience, a God deeply invested in sexual regulation, sacrificial rituals, strict boundaries, and the exclusion of rival deities. A God built around the idea of chosenness, not as metaphor, but as literal hierarchy. Christianity follows under very different historical conditions, reshaped by Roman occupation and radically expanded through the influence of Paul. The narrow tribal boundaries loosen, but the ambition grows. The message is no longer confined to a single people or territory. It is aimed at the entire world. And historically, that expansion is rarely gentle. Imperial adoption transforms belief into policy. Crusades follow. Forced conversions become normalized. Missionaries arrive not alone, but alongside armies, law, and administrative power. Islam emerges centuries later, returning to a more uncompromising form of monotheism, one that abandons ethnic chosenness but replaces it with a universal claim backed by political and military authority. A final revelation, a final prophet, and a system in which belief, law, and governance are tightly fused, leaving little space between faith and power. For Dawkins, the differences between these religions are often overstated, especially by those who are deeply invested in defending their own tradition. He is not primarily interested in rituals, sects, clothing, dietary laws, or theological fine print. What interests him is the shared mental structure beneath them. This is why, throughout the book, he treats the Abrahamic religions less as fundamentally distinct systems and more as variations on the same psychological framework. This is where the God hypothesis becomes fully visible. The Abrahamic God is not an abstract principle or a poetic metaphor for order. He is personal. He watches, judges, punishes, forgives, demands loyalty, and responds emotionally to obedience and disobedience. In other words, he is a character endowed with recognizably human emotions, projected onto a cosmic scale. Dawkins contrasts this figure with the God of the Enlightenment, the deist God of thinkers like Voltaire and Thomas Paine, a God who designs the universe, sets its laws in motion, and then withdraws entirely. No prayers are answered. No miracles interrupt natural law. No moral surveillance monitors human behavior. The universe runs on its own. Historically, even this restrained version of God was treated as dangerous. Deists were mocked, marginalized, and frequently equated with atheists, because once divine intervention is removed, authority begins to dissolve. Today the labels may be softer, the language more polite, but the philosophical problem remains exactly the same. Because whether the God is personal or distant, interventionist or absent, once we claim a supernatural intelligence as the creator of the universe, the God hypothesis is still firmly on the table, and Dawkins insists on one point above all others. This hypothesis should not be treated as sacred, protected, or emotionally insulated. It should be evaluated as what it claims to be, an explanation. Which leads, inevitably, to the central question that refuses to go away. Does this idea actually explain the universe? Or does it merely replace one mystery with something even more obscure, even more complex, and far harder to justify? At this point in the book, Dawkins appears to take what might initially seem like an unexpected detour, because while the discussion has been centered on the God hypothesis as a philosophical and scientific problem, he suddenly turns his attention toward the early history of the United States, the Founding Fathers, and the principle of secularism. Yet this shift is neither accidental nor nostalgic, and certainly not an exercise in historical trivia, but rather an attempt to demonstrate something far more structural and far more enduring. That the idea of God is never confined to the private interior of belief, that it almost inevitably spills outward into politics, power, law, and the architecture of entire societies, whether its believers acknowledge this leakage or not. The familiar narrative tells us that the Founding Fathers were deists, and Dawkins broadly accepts this characterization. But he immediately adds a clarification that destabilizes its comforting simplicity. Because if we were to take their private letters, essays, and personal reflections, and place them within the modern political and cultural landscape, many of these men would almost certainly be described today not as deists, but as atheists in all but name. Yet for Dawkins, this distinction is secondary, because what truly matters is not what they privately believed about God, but what they were almost unanimously and obsessively committed to when it came to the state itself. Namely, a fierce and uncompromising secularism that treated religion as a strictly private affair and viewed its entanglement with governance as a fundamental danger. To make this point, Dawkins opens with a quotation that feels deliberately chosen to unsettle expectations, because it does not come from an atheist philosopher or a secular intellectual, but from Barry Goldwater, a conservative Republican senator and an icon of American right-wing politics, who in 1981 openly criticized the growing intrusion of religion into government, warning that invoking God in politics was an extraordinarily powerful weapon, and precisely for that reason, an exceptionally dangerous one. Expressing deep frustration with religious groups attempting to impose their moral doctrines on the state, and speaking with barely concealed anger about efforts to control votes and public policy, in the name of God. Today, those words sound almost unimaginable, because to repeat them in contemporary American politics would likely result in immediate accusations of hostility toward religion or outright moral corruption. Yet Dawkins's point is sharp and difficult to dismiss, because this attitude was not radical or marginal at the founding of the Republic, but entirely consistent with its original spirit, even though there is now a strong tendency, particularly on the American right, to retroactively recast the Founding Fathers as champions of Christian nationalism, a rewriting of history that collapses under even minimal scrutiny of the historical record. In 1796, during George Washington's presidency, the Treaty of Tripoli, signed by John Adams and ratified without controversy, explicitly stated that the United States was in no sense founded on the Christian religion, a sentence that today would provoke outrage, denial, and endless cable news debates, but which at the time passed without objection from politicians or citizens alike, precisely because it was not intended as provocation or polemic, but simply as a straightforward statement of fact that aligned perfectly with the constitutional framework of the new nation. Here Dawkins identifies a paradox that borders on the absurd. America, a nation founded on constitutional secularism, has become one of the most religious societies in the Western world, while Britain, which maintains an official state church, is among the least religious. And Dawkins is careful not to pretend that he possesses a definitive explanation for this reversal, instead offering several possibilities, ranging from Britain's exhaustion after centuries of sectarian violence and Protestant Catholic bloodshed, to America's immigrant history, in which displaced communities may have turned churches into surrogate families and centers of social stability. Yet the explanation Dawkins finds most compelling is also the most unsettling, because it suggests that America's religious intensity may be a direct consequence of its constitutional secularism, since when religion is not supported or regulated by the state, it enters the free market, where churches must compete for members, donations, and influence, and where competition inevitably rewards extremity, volume, certainty, and spectacle, transforming belief into a product that must be aggressively advertised, simplified, and emotionally charged, until God himself begins to resemble a brand, marketed with the same techniques used to sell soap or political loyalty. In Britain, the situation is inverted, because the church is embedded within the establishment, stripped of urgency and drama, rendered routine, ceremonial, and largely harmless, a dynamic captured by the Anglican priest Giles Fraser, whom Dawkins cites describing the traditional English village vicar as gentle, unobtrusive, fond of tea, and deeply uninterested in stopping strangers to ask whether they have been saved, leading Fraser to make the striking claim that this very mildness has effectively immunized the British public against Christianity. But the warning is never far away, because if this equilibrium were to collapse and religion were to regain intensity and political force, Britain's own dark history of sectarian conflict lies ready beneath the surface, waiting to reassert itself. When Dawkins returns his focus to the United States, his tone hardens, as he argues that the current level of religious fanaticism would have genuinely horrified the Founding Fathers, for whom a politician's religious beliefs were meant to remain strictly private. Which is why George W. Bush's suggestion that atheists might not qualify as full citizens strikes Dawkins as openly discriminatory, a sentiment whose ugliness becomes undeniable the moment the word atheist is replaced with Jew or Muslim. Dawkins then draws attention to the social isolation experienced by American atheists, citing journalist Natalie Angier, who describes the peculiar loneliness of being surrounded by people while remaining invisible. And yet Dawkins insists that this isolation is partly illusory, because atheists in America are far more numerous than commonly believed, more numerous even than religious Jews. But what they lack is not numbers, but organization, and more importantly, safety, because there are very real reasons to be afraid. He recounts a disturbing story told by David Mills, in which a self-proclaimed faith healer urges diabetics to abandon insulin and cancer patients to stop treatment, prompting Mills to protest and seek help from the police, only to be met with responses that are chilling in their casual cruelty. "You are interfering with God's work. No one will protect a damned atheist. And even, I hope they beat you up." A story that is not isolated, but echoed in the records compiled by Margaret Downey, documenting cases of atheists being fired from jobs, disowned by families, threatened, and even murdered. Dawkins' conclusion is blunt and difficult to evade. In modern America, it is nearly impossible for an openly atheist candidate to be elected to high office. And while Congress almost certainly contains atheists in statistical terms, they must remain silent, hidden behind safer identities. According to Dawkins, this reality would have deeply appalled Jefferson, Madison, and Adams, men who disagreed sharply about theology, but shared a profound hatred of theocracy. A sentiment echoed when Dawkins briefly shifts his gaze to India, invoking Gandhi's inclusive secularism and Nehru's uncompromising resistance to religious power, whose words, Dawkins suggests, could easily have been spoken by Jefferson himself. Secularism is not hostility toward religion, but the equal distance of the state from all beliefs. And this brings Dawkins back, inevitably, to his central claim. Because while the deist God may appear more civilized, restrained, and aesthetically pleasing than the violent and jealous God of Scripture, this refinement does nothing to increase the likelihood of his existence, since in any form, abstract or personal, distant or interventionist, the God hypothesis remains unnecessary. What follows will be sharper still, as Dawkins moves to argue that the God hypothesis is not merely redundant, but statistically implausible, dismantling the classical arguments for God's existence one by one, before confronting the final protective shield surrounding belief itself. Is God truly unknowable, or have we deliberately wrapped him in the armor of untouchability? That is where the next section begins. Agnosticism is often worn like a badge of intellectual maturity, as though the simple act of saying, "I don't know," automatically lifts a person into a higher, cleaner, more reasonable position. And it is precisely this unexamined prestige that Richard Dawkins takes issue with. Because, interestingly enough, he does not begin this chapter by attacking religion at all, but by turning his attention toward agnosticism itself, arguing that the real problem is not uncertainty as such, but the reflexive and almost ritualistic use of "I don't know" as a shelter, applied indiscriminately to every uncomfortable question, regardless of whether that question is genuinely open or has merely been declared untouchable by habit and reverence. Dawkins makes an important distinction early on, one that is often blurred in everyday conversation, namely that some questions are genuinely unresolved because the evidence is not yet available, while others are treated as unresolved because people have quietly agreed not to push too hard. And to illustrate this, he recalls an old memory from his school years involving a confident, muscular Christian preacher, a man who did not actually hate atheists, and even respected them in a strange way as people who were wrong, but at least bold, while reserving his deepest contempt for agnostics, the fence-sitters who hovered safely in the middle without committing themselves to a position. And Dawkins admits that he agrees with this preacher only partially, and for entirely different reasons. Because for him, the issue is not courage or personality, but whether agnosticism is intellectually justified in a given case. Dawkins is very precise here, insisting that when evidence is genuinely unavailable, agnosticism is not merely acceptable, but intellectually responsible. And he points to Carl Sagan's famous response to questions about extraterrestrial life as a perfect example, where Sagan openly admitted that he did not rely on gut feelings, but instead suspended judgment until evidence arrived. A stance that is not a sign of weakness, but of scientific discipline. And the same reasoning applies to unresolved scientific problems, such as the cause of the Permian extinction, where multiple competing explanations exist, and the honest answer, at least for now, is simply that we do not know. But Dawkins' real challenge begins when he asks whether the existence of God truly belongs in this same category, whether God's existence is genuinely a question that is in principle forever beyond evidence and rational evaluation, or whether it has been placed there because it is emotionally charged, culturally protected, and philosophically inconvenient to treat it like any other explanatory claim. At this point, Dawkins introduces a distinction that becomes central to the argument, separating temporary agnosticism from permanent agnosticism, where the former means we do not yet know, but could in principle find out, while the latter claims that no matter what evidence arises, the question can never be answered. And Dawkins observes that many philosophers are remarkably eager to assign God to this second category, because once they do, an enormous amount of intellectual pressure simply disappears. There is no longer any need to evaluate probabilities, to weigh evidence, or to follow the argument wherever it might lead. This, Dawkins argues, is a mistake, and history strongly supports his skepticism, because it is filled with confident declarations of things that were said to be unknowable in principle, and were later explained with almost embarrassing ease, with Auguste Comte's famous insistence that humanity would never know the chemical composition of stars, standing as a particularly striking example, since today this information is so commonplace that it barely registers as remarkable, revealing that claims of principled unknowability have a remarkably poor track record. It is here that Dawkins places the God hypothesis in an uncomfortable but unavoidable position, treating it as a scientific hypothesis, not necessarily one that is easy to test, and perhaps not even one that is practically testable at all, but still one whose probability can be discussed, because the absence of decisive proof does not automatically place existence and non-existence on equal footing. And this is precisely where the poverty of agnosticism begins to reveal itself. Dawkins introduces the idea of a probability spectrum, a continuum ranging from absolute certainty to absolute disbelief, and notes that many people instinctively place themselves at the midpoint, as if 50-50 represents intellectual neutrality. Even though in everyday life, we almost never behave this way, because while we cannot conclusively disprove the existence of fairies at the bottom of the garden, or logically eliminate the possibility of invisible unicorns, we nonetheless live our lives as if they do not exist. This is where Bertrand Russell's famous teapot enters the discussion, the hypothetical teapot orbiting the sun somewhere between Earth and Mars, which cannot be disproven and yet does not obligate anyone to take its existence seriously. And Dawkins' point is both simple and deeply unsettling to believers. The burden of proof does not rest on the skeptic, and there is no rational justification for granting God immunity from this standard. Dawkins is careful not to claim absolute certainty, and he does not place himself at 100% confidence in God's non-existence, but instead treats God the way we treat garden fairies, as an idea with no evidence, extremely low probability, and a life lived accordingly. And what truly angers him is not belief itself, but privilege, the special exemption that shields God from the scrutiny applied to every other explanatory claim. Because this exemption is not merely a philosophical curiosity, but something that shapes laws, education, violence, obedience, and silence. And that is why, for Dawkins, thinking seriously about the God hypothesis is not an optional intellectual exercise or a private preference, but a necessity. Whenever the tension between science and religion is discussed, a familiar figure almost inevitably steps onto the stage as the calm and reasonable mediator, offering what sounds like a mature, balanced, almost soothing solution. And that figure is Stephen Jay Gould's proposal known as NOMA, the idea of non-overlapping magisteria, according to which science concerns itself with facts and mechanisms, while religion occupies a separate domain devoted to meaning, values, and morality, each staying politely in its own lane. No collisions, no confrontation, no intellectual discomfort. At first glance, this proposal feels like a relief, because it sounds reasonable, it sounds civilized, it sounds like wisdom earned through restraint, and many people hear it and think, finally the conflict is over, we can all go home. But Dawkins does something disarmingly simple at this point, because instead of applauding the compromise, he stops, pauses, and asks a question so basic that it feels almost rude to raise it. Is it really solved? Or does it merely feel that way because no one is pushing anymore? According to Dawkins, NOMA is not neutral wisdom at all, but an act of excessive politeness, an unnecessary intellectual retreat in which scientists, especially those who feel uneasy about confronting the God hypothesis directly, silence themselves out of courtesy rather than conviction, while theologians are more than happy to occupy the territory left behind, confidently insisting that God lies beyond the reach of scientific inquiry, and therefore beyond criticism, beyond evaluation, beyond probability itself. Dawkins notes that theologians like Alistair McGrath are particularly fond of this maneuver, insisting that God cannot be disproven by science, and Dawkins readily agrees with this claim on a purely technical level. But he immediately points out how astonishingly weak this defense actually is, because the exact same statement applies just as well to Russell's teapot orbiting the sun, or to the flying spaghetti monster, or to any number of imaginary entities that are carefully defined to remain just out of reach. And there is a reason Dawkins keeps scribbling the same word in the margins, almost obsessively, as a reminder of the flaw in this reasoning. Teapot. McGrath invokes Huxley, invokes Gould, invokes the supposed humility of science, insisting that because God lies outside the scientific method, science must remain silent. But Dawkins's response to this is almost offensively straightforward, because he simply asks why. Why exactly God should be granted an exemption from the skepticism applied to every other claim of cosmic importance. Why a supernatural intelligence allegedly responsible for designing the universe should enjoy a level of immunity that no other metaphysical idea receives. If such an intelligence exists, Dawkins argues, then the universe is fundamentally different from a universe in which no such intelligence exists. And this difference is not poetic, not metaphorical, not merely emotional or existential, but a concrete difference in how reality itself operates. And questions about how reality operates are not the private property of religion, but the very definition of what science exists to investigate. NOMA insists that science asks how, while religion asks why. But Dawkins pauses here and asks a more basic question that is rarely examined, namely what a why question actually is. Because not every sentence that begins with the word why automatically possesses depth or meaning. And asking, why are unicorns hollow, does not become profound simply because it is grammatically correct. Just as asking, what color is hope, does not generate insight simply by sounding abstract. And the inability of science to answer a question does not logically imply that religion can. Even respected scientists such as Martin Rees sometimes push questions like, why is there something rather than nothing, beyond the reach of science? But Dawkins's response is careful and precise, because he asks why such questions should then fall into the hands of theology. What special expertise theologians possess that qualifies them to answer questions about the ultimate structure of reality? And here he makes a brutally honest observation. Theology does not generate independent knowledge. We can study sacred texts historically, literarily, psychologically, and sociologically, of course. But claims about the nature of God itself lack any external mechanism of verification, which leads Dawkins to his famously uncomfortable question, one that cuts through centuries of assumed authority with unsettling ease. Why the priest and not the gardener? When an astronomer says, "At this point we must leave the question to the clergy," what they are really saying is, "I don't know." But ignorance does not magically generate authority, and not knowing the answer to a question does not justify handing that question to someone else at random. Because ignorance does not become wisdom simply by wearing robes. NOMA creates an even deeper problem when it comes to morality, because Gould suggests that ethics belongs squarely within religion's domain. But Dawkins asks the question Gould avoids entirely. Which religion, which scripture, which chapter, and which verse? Since sacred texts are riddled with moral contradictions, often within the same book, containing commands to stone, orders to kill, and explicit contempt for women and outsiders. Passages that modern believers routinely reject, but only by appealing to moral standards that exist independently of the text itself. If you already possess a moral compass capable of judging scripture, then religion cannot be the source of morality, and at best becomes a label applied after the fact, a retrospective justification rather than a foundation. Dawkins' conclusion here is simple and devastating. If we select moral values using criteria external to religion, then religion does not ground morality. It merely borrows it. And this is precisely where NOMA collapses under its own weight. Because religion never limits itself to meaning alone, and never has, but instead makes explicit factual claims about the world, claiming that miracles occur, that prayers are answered, that natural laws are suspended, that bodies rise from graves and minds survive death, claims that are not metaphors but assertions about reality. And questions such as whether Jesus had a biological father, whether Lazarus was truly raised from the dead, or whether Jesus returned to life after 3 days, are not poetic abstractions, but propositions that are, in principle, either true or false. And if tomorrow conclusive DNA evidence appeared, no believer would calmly reply, "Wrong magisterium," but would instead celebrate it as the ultimate vindication of faith. NOMA functions only in the absence of evidence, and the moment evidence appears, NOMA would be the first doctrine quietly discarded. Dawkins' objection, then, is unmistakable. The God hypothesis, whether interventionist or deistic, remains a hypothesis, a claim about reality. And every claim about reality ultimately falls within the scope of scientific evaluation. Because the difference between evolution and design is not a minor philosophical disagreement, but a clash between two fundamentally incompatible views of how the world works. And according to Dawkins, that clash has already been decided. Why evolution strikes at the heart of the God hypothesis with near fatal force, and why this matters more than any abstract theological distinction, is exactly where the next chapter begins. What Dawkins does at this stage of the God Delusion is often misunderstood, because many readers expect an aggressive denial of God, a loud declaration that belief itself is foolish. But instead, they encounter something much more unsettling, a calm shift in perspective that quietly changes the entire structure of the debate. Rather than asking whether God exists, Dawkins asks what kind of explanation the God hypothesis actually is, and whether it truly does the work people think it does when they invoke it to explain the universe. The central problem he introduces is deceptively simple, yet devastating once it is fully absorbed. If the universe really was designed by a conscious, intelligent creator, then that creator must itself be at least as complex as the universe it supposedly explains. And complexity, as we know from every other domain of inquiry, does not come for free. The more complex something is, the more information it contains, the more structure it possesses, and the more demanding it becomes to explain how it came to be. When people say that God explains the complexity of life, consciousness, and the laws of physics, they rarely pause to consider that they have not eliminated complexity at all. They have simply relocated it. Instead of asking how the universe became so intricate, they now have to ask how a timeless, immaterial, omniscient mind, capable of designing universes, came into existence without any explanation whatsoever. In Dawkins' view, this move does not solve the mystery of existence. It magnifies it, because it attempts to explain something difficult by appealing to something even more difficult. This is why he describes the God hypothesis as almost fatal to itself. A good explanation reduces mystery rather than multiplying it, and an explanation that relies on an even greater unexplained complexity is not an explanation in any meaningful sense. It is a postponement, a conceptual escape hatch that allows us to stop thinking at precisely the moment where thinking becomes uncomfortable. And it is here that evolution enters the discussion, not as a weapon, but as a contrast. Evolution does not claim to answer every existential question, nor does it pretend to provide purpose or comfort, but it does something historically unprecedented. It demonstrates how extraordinary complexity can arise from simplicity, gradually, and without foresight, through a process that is blind, yet relentlessly selective. Biological complexity, including the emergence of minds capable of reflection, doubt, and belief, no longer requires the intervention of a guiding intelligence once natural selection is properly understood. Life does not appear all at once, fully designed and fully formed. It accumulates, step by step, across immense stretches of time, through tiny variations that either survive or disappear. Evolution is not poetic, and it is not kind, but it works. And that functional sufficiency is precisely what makes it so threatening to traditional explanations that rely on intentional design. If complexity can emerge without intention, then the strongest motivation for invoking God as an explanatory necessity begins to dissolve. God no longer functions as the indispensable answer to the question of, how could this possibly exist? And instead becomes something else, a familiar mental habit, a culturally reinforced response to uncertainty, a way of protecting ourselves from the discomfort of unanswered questions. Dawkins is careful not to replace theology with dogmatism. He does not claim absolute certainty, nor does he pretend that science can offer final answers about everything. What he insists on instead is probabilistic reasoning, the same kind of reasoning we already use in every other area of our lives. We do not demand perfect knowledge before making judgments about likelihood, and we do not suspend critical thinking simply because an idea has emotional or historical weight. This is why agnosticism, while often presented as the most reasonable position, does not entirely satisfy Dawkins. Saying, "we do not know," can be intellectually honest, but it can also become a refuge that prevents further evaluation. We are technically agnostic about countless hypothetical entities, yet we still regard them as overwhelmingly unlikely. Invisible dragons, cosmic teapots, supernatural beings that leave no detectable trace. These ideas are not treated with reverent neutrality, and Dawkins argues that the God hypothesis should not be granted a special exemption simply because it is old, widespread, or comforting. No protected status, no automatic respect, no intellectual immunity. And perhaps this is the deepest reason why the God delusion unsettles so many readers. It does not demand that belief be abandoned, but it quietly removes its pedestal. God is no longer placed outside the realm of ordinary claims. Instead, the idea is brought down to earth, examined alongside other hypotheses, and judged by the same standards of explanatory power and necessity. This shift has profound consequences. Because once God is no longer the guaranteed source of meaning, the universe begins to look indifferent rather than intentional, and life appears contingent rather than planned. The universe does not promise significance, and existence does not come with built-in reassurance. That realization can feel like abandonment, but it can also feel like clarity. Perhaps meaning is not something waiting to be discovered, but something that emerges from how we respond to a world that does not revolve around us. Perhaps the discomfort Dawkins provokes is not a flaw of his argument, but its most honest feature. In this video, we explored why the God hypothesis can be treated as a scientific claim, why evolutionary theory quietly undermines the need for a designer, and why separating science and religion through comforting boundaries ultimately avoids rather than resolves the problem. The goal was not destruction, but examination. Not certainty, but intellectual integrity. Beliefs rarely collapse under attack. They erode when better explanations make them unnecessary. If these ideas stayed with you until the end, then the discomfort did its job. And sometimes, staying with that discomfort is the most serious form of thinking we can do. Thank you for listening.